When you hear that investors are buying American homes, who do you picture? BlackRock, private equity, some giant corporation buying 500 houses at a time? There's a pretty good chance the investor you're picturing looks a lot more like your neighbor than Wall Street. So today I want to find out who these investors actually are, how much of America's housing really is being bought up by giant corporations, are investors competing with first-time homebuyers, and maybe, most importantly, how far away the average homeowner is from becoming a real estate investor themselves. My name is Mark. Welcome to the Gentleman Broker Mortgage Brief. Being called a real estate investor certainly has a power ring to it. Surely you must be a large corporation, own dozens if not hundreds of properties, and are probably some kind of slumlord to boot. But the reality is, it might be the couple who kept their first house when they bought their second, the guy who owns a duplex, the family with a cabin they rent out on Airbnb when they're not using it, the person who bought a small condo specifically as a vacation rental, or somebody who bought one house and then eventually bought another. These people are all investors too. And when you actually look at who's buying investment properties in America, the story is considerably different from the one we normally hear. In 2025, investors purchased roughly 534,000 homes in the United States. That represented about 11.3% of all home purchases. But let's grab the statistic I find much more revealing. Roughly 2/3 of those investor purchases were made by small investors, not Wall Street. First, what do we even mean by investor? I think this is where a lot of the confusion begins. We hear investors bought 11% of America's homes. And it's really easy to mentally replace the word investor with corporation, but those aren't the same thing. An investor is simply somebody buying real estate primarily for an economic purpose rather than to occupy as their primary residence. And that category can include some very different people, like the ones I mentioned. And yes, a company owning 20,000 single-family homes is also an investor. But obviously, those aren't remotely the same operation. And that's why the headline number doesn't tell the whole story. Realtor.com's 2026 investor report used deeded records to look at homes purchased through corporate structures like LLCs, partnerships, etc. They divided those buyers by size: small, medium, large, and mega investors. And what they found was almost the opposite of what you might assume. Small investors are increasingly dominating investor purchases. In 2025, small investors accounted for roughly 63% of all purchases. Mega investors, only about 7.5%. And mega investor purchasing has fallen almost 70% from its 2021 peak. So while Wall Street has had major reduction in real estate investing, it hasn't disappeared from residential real estate. Far from it. But the investors buying houses today is much more likely to be people like you and I, rather than private equity. So did Wall Street buy up all the homes? No. But I also don't think we should swing so far the other direction that we pretend institutional investors don't matter, because they do. A separate Realtor.com analysis defined institutional investors as entities with more than 350 single-family purchases since 2015. Across the entire country, those institutional investors represented about 1% of single-family home purchases. But wait, 350 is still a lot of homes. 200 is a lot of homes for a company to own. Yeah, I agree. Even lowering the threshold to investors with at least 100 single-family properties only brought the shares to about 1.7%. And while even 80 to 100 properties owned by an individual is still pretty impressive, it's not the huge corporations like we may have assumed. And over the decade, from 2015 through 2025, Realtor.com identified roughly 5.5 million investor purchases compared with approximately 58 million non-investor purchases. In other words, regular buyers outnumbered investors roughly 10 to 1. But there's a really important caveat. Real estate is local. Institutional investors don't distribute their purchases evenly across America. They concentrate, especially in certain Sunbelt and lower cost markets. Memphis, Charlotte, parts of Texas, Florida, and Georgia. Take Memphis, for example. Institutional investors represented about 4.4% of those home purchases. Charlotte was about 4.2%. Meanwhile, major investors were almost non-existent in some of America's most expensive markets. New York City was around 0.1%, and San Francisco, 0.2%. So two things can be true simultaneously. Institutional investors own a relatively small portion of American housing nationally, and they can have a very noticeable presence in a particular city, neighborhood, or even zip code. Now let's flip the script. If giant institutions aren't responsible for most investor purchases, who is? That's it. It's the people with relatively small portfolios. Another analysis of investor-owned housing found that more than 90% of investor-owned homes belong to landlords with fewer than 11 properties. Expand that to landlords with between 1 and 50 properties, and they controlled about 95% of investor inventory. So you see what's happening here. Everyone hates investors buying up all the homes, save some for the rest of us, right? But they're okay with Uncle Earl having a cabin he rents out. They're okay with Aunt May having an Airbnb. And they're certainly okay with the young military family that relocated and decided to rent their old home instead of selling. There's a huge difference between saying investors own these homes and saying these are everyday people that happen to make money off of more than one property. Now, we are starting to see where the next door investor starts to make sense. Your neighbor owns a rental. Maybe your realtor owns two. I certainly have some. Maybe somebody inherited their parents' house and decided not to sell it. These people don't necessarily wake up one morning and announce, I'm going to be a real estate investor. And then they gobble up homes from hardworking Americans. Sometimes people become investors almost by accident. Imagine you bought your first house at 28. 10 years later, you're married. You have 2 kids. You need another bedroom. You've built equity. Your income has increased. So you buy another house. And instead of selling the first one, you rent it. Congratulations. You just became a real estate investor. Your portfolio consists of 1 primary and 1 rental property. But you're still an investor, and there are a lot more people doing some version of that than there are giant corporations buying entire neighborhoods. And actually, that first investment doesn't even necessarily have to begin with a second house. Maybe you buy a duplex. You live in one side and you rent out the other. Maybe the house you buy has an ADU. Maybe you rent a bedroom. There are owner-occupied loan programs that can allow eligible borrowers to purchase certain 2, 3, or 4-unit properties while living in one of the units. The point isn't that everybody should do that. The point is that the line between homeowner and real estate investor may be a lot thinner than people think. Hey friends, go ahead and hit that subscribe button for me. I'd really appreciate the support. Now, this is where I don't want the episode to become a defense to all real estate investors, because there's another side to this. Remember that 63% figure. Small investors dominate investor purchases, and look at what they're buying. In 2025, the median purchase price for small investors was about $330,000. The overall market median was about $440,000. So small investors were buying roughly 25% below the average market median. And who else tends to shop in that portion of the market? First-time homebuyers, moderate income buyers, people looking for starter homes. That's where the conversation in whether investors are a problem becomes legitimate. Because it isn't necessarily the giant private equity company that a first-time buyer is competing against. It may be another person trying to buy their 4th rental property. Let's look at Kansas City. Small investors represented roughly 9.5% of all purchases, and the median home purchased by a small investor was around $240,000. With the overall market median being around $347,000. That's exactly the portion of the market where entry-level buyers need housing. Charlotte tells a similar story. Small investors there were buying at a median of around 250,000 compared with an overall market median around 410. So when someone says investors are competing with first-time buyers, there's truth to that. But keep in mind, the investor on the other side of the transaction may be your coworker rather than a corporation. And frankly, if you're the first-time buyer who lost the house, that distinction probably doesn't make you feel any better. Whether the competing buyer owns 4 houses or 4,000, you still didn't get the house. So small investors aren't harmless simply because they're small. They are still participants in the market, and sometimes they absolutely compete for the same homes owner-occupants need. There are a few reasons to own real estate outside your primary home: monthly cash flow, long-term wealth building, and tax inheritance or other financial considerations. Let's look at each of these from the investor side for a minute. Cash flow. A rental property can provide cash flow as a benefit to the owner to support their quality of life. This cash flow is utilized more as income, helping to pay bills and maintain a certain quality of life. Think of someone who owns a duplex and rents out one side while living in the other. Think of a retired vet renting out one of his homes to offset his Social Security. Think of a teacher who received a home as an inheritance, moves into it, and then rents out her old home to a friend. Maybe she's using the few $100s in residual income to help fix up her mom's old house. None of those people needed to become real estate moguls. The property is simply doing a job for them. It's producing income. Then there's long-term wealth building. This type of small investor is specifically looking to buy a home in order to rent it out, allowing the principal to be paid down over time by rental income, potentially benefiting from appreciation and building equity. Eventually, that investor may leverage some of that equity through financing to help purchase additional properties. Then those properties may cash flow, continue having their loans paid down, and eventually the investor reaches retirement with a portfolio of properties with substantial equity. At that point, maybe they sell the portfolio and retire. Maybe they keep the properties and live off the residual cash flow. Maybe they leave them to their children. That's a completely different goal than a person who simply wants another $500 a month coming in. But both are investors. And this is also where keeping a first home can become really interesting. Imagine you bought a starter home 5 or 10 years ago. You've built equity, maybe you've got a great mortgage rate, now your family has outgrown it. The traditional assumption is sell house A, use the equity to buy house B, and maybe that's absolutely the right decision. But you should at least ask the other question. What happens if I don't sell it? Could house A work as a rental? Does the expected rent cover the mortgage, taxes, insurance, maintenance, and vacancy rate? Does keeping it prevent you from qualifying for house B? Would selling it give you a dramatically better financial position? You have to run the numbers. But that single decision, keeping the first house when you buy the second, is how a lot of ordinary people begin building a real estate portfolio. Not with 50 properties, with 2. Then there can be tax or financial considerations. This is where depreciation, deductible operating expenses, capital gains, inheritance, and potential tax-deferred strategies can start affecting whether someone buys, holds, or sells certain properties. Maybe it's a property you inherited. Maybe it's one you've owned for 20 years. Maybe there's a significant tax consequence to selling it. Maybe there's an estate planning consideration. I'm not a CPA or a tax attorney, so I'm not going to turn this into some tax advice. But taxation is absolutely part of why real estate can be attractive to investors and why sometimes keeping a property makes more sense than immediately selling it. And then there's leverage. This is what makes real estate very different from many other investments. You don't necessarily have to pay $400,000 to control a $400,000 asset. You may put down a fraction of that amount and finance the rest. Of course, leverage works both ways. It can amplify your returns and it can amplify your losses. Which brings us to something I think social media often conveniently forgets. Of the 3 generalized versions of real estate investing I mentioned, the second one, long-term equity and wealth building, probably creates the most seductive version of the story. You buy the house, the tenant pays the mortgage, you become wealthy while doing absolutely nothing. That sounds fantastic. But it's incomplete. The roof doesn't care about your cash flow spreadsheet, neither does the water heater or the furnace, or when the tenant stops paying. Then there's property tax, special assessments, insurance premiums and deductible increases, vacancy rates, repairs, maintenance, property management, and the list goes on. Real estate investing has its ups and downs, and sometimes really difficult tenants. The Census Bureau and HUD's Rental Housing Finance Survey specifically tracks things like property values, mortgage debt, rents, improvements, ownership, and operating expenses across America's rental housing stock. There's a reason for that. A rental house is a business. It happens to be a business with a kitchen and a roof, but it's a business nonetheless. That's something you need to think about when considering becoming an investor. Owning another house doesn't automatically make you wealthy. You have to be consistent, do your research, buy the right asset for you, and you have to operate it responsibly. And this is where I think people need to stop falling in love with the title real estate investor and actually look at the investment. Real estate doesn't become a good investment simply because it's real estate. There are phenomenal rental properties. There are terrible rental properties. There are people who have built substantial wealth through real estate, and there are people who own 3 houses and have 3 headaches. For hundreds of years in this country, we had an imaginary line. Hotels over here, homes over there, and in the fringe, we allowed a few bed and breakfasts and boutique rentals. And then something happened that created an entirely different type of next door investor. Short-term rentals, Airbnbs, VRBO, the vacation rental market exploded. This didn't just open up a world of possibilities as an alternative to a hotel or motel for travelers. Suddenly, the average person who wanted to own a rental property didn't necessarily need a traditional year-long tenant to generate income from real estate. The everyday person could own a cabin, a condo, a beach house, an ADU, even a basement apartment, and they could rent it for days instead of years. And short-term rentals have become an enormous industry. Airbnb reported that travel through its platform generated more than $93 billion in U.S. economic activity in 2025. 46% of hosts surveyed said hosting helps them cover rising living costs. And this is where the definition of investor gets even fuzzier. Imagine someone owns a cabin. They use it 6 weekends a year. The rest of the time, they rent it. Are they a homeowner, a landlord, a hospitality business, a real estate investor? Technically, a little bit of all 4. And there are different versions of this. One person rents a spare bedroom. Another rents an ADU behind their house. Another owns a vacation property they occasionally rent. Another specifically buys 3 properties and operates them entirely as short-term rentals. Those are completely different businesses. So when we talk about Airbnb taking homes off the market, we need to be careful. Not every Airbnb listing represents a house that otherwise would have been available to a family as a primary residence. Some are rooms, some are ADUs, some are seasonal properties, some are owner-occupied, and some absolutely are entire houses purchased specifically for short-term rental. And those can have legitimate impacts on housing supply, especially in smaller vacation communities where the number of homes is already limited. If 100 houses in a small mountain town become vacation rentals, that's very different from 100 Airbnb listings spread across a city with hundreds of thousands of housing units. Again, real estate is local. And then there's another side to the short-term rental opportunity that gets left out of the social media version. You don't just need to know what the property could rent for. You need to understand actual occupancy, cleaning, platform fees, furniture, utilities, local lodging taxes, licensing, insurance, and perhaps the most important, local regulations. Because if your investment only works as a short-term rental, what happens if the city changes the rules? Once again, you're operating a business. The business just happens to have guests instead of tenants. So are investors good or bad for housing? After everything we've talked about, I don't think that's actually the right question. Investors do several things simultaneously. They provide rental housing, and that's important. Not everyone wants to own. Not everyone can own. And frankly, not everyone should own at every stage of their life. People still need houses to rent. Investors provide those houses. They can also take distressed or neglected properties, renovate them, and put them back to productive use. But investors can also compete directly with owner occupants, especially at the lower end of the market. We already saw that small investors tend to purchase homes well below the overall market median. Those are often the same houses first-time buyers need. Institutional ownership can create additional concerns when companies accumulate a significant concentration of homes within individual neighborhoods. And short-term rentals can create very real housing supply issues in certain communities. So I'm not interested in pretending investors are universally good, and I'm not interested in pretending they're universally all bad. I think we need to ask a better question. Who's buying the house? Where are they buying it? What are they paying? And what are they doing with it afterwards? Because there's a major difference between a company buying 5,000 starter homes in a handful of markets, a family owning 3 long-term rentals, and somebody renting out the cabin they use 6 weekends out of the year. Calling all 3 of them simply investors may be technically accurate, but it doesn't tell us very much. So let's go back to where we started. Investors purchased roughly 534,000 homes in 2025, about 11.3% of all purchases. That's a lot of houses. But small investors represented roughly 63% of those investor purchases. Mega investors represented about 7.5%. And under a stricter definition, institutional investors represented only around 1% of overall single-family purchases nationally. So yes, Wall Street invests in housing, and there are legitimate conversations to have about where, how much, and whether policy should restrict that activity. But Wall Street isn't the whole story. Main Street invests in housing too. Your neighbor, your coworker, your parent, maybe you. The word investor sounds like an identity, like there are homeowners and then something else. There are these people called investors, but maybe it's better understood as an action. You become a real estate investor when you decide to own real estate as an investment. That's it. You don't need a skyscraper. You don't need a hedge fund. You don't need 100 houses or even 10 homes. Sometimes the difference between being a homeowner and being a real estate investor is one additional property. So, should you become one? Maybe. And I know that's not a very exciting answer, but it's the responsible one. I think real estate can be an incredible wealth building tool, but I also think people should understand what they're buying, and more importantly, why they're buying it. Are you looking for cash flow today? Are you trying to build equity and wealth over 20 or 30 years? Did you inherit a property? Are you considering keeping your current home when you move? Did you want a vacation property that you can generate income when you're not using it? Start with the objective, run the numbers, and don't buy an investment property because someone on TikTok told you passive income is easy. Don't keep your old house because someone told you you should never sell real estate. Don't buy an Airbnb because you saw someone else's revenue screenshot. And don't assume appreciation is going to bail out bad numbers. Instead, you should ask, what will it realistically rent for? What will it actually cost? How much cash do I need in reserves? What's my financing? What's my exit strategy? And most importantly, does this investment still make sense if everything doesn't go perfectly? Because that's probably one of the biggest differences between investing and speculating. An investor has a plan for what the asset is supposed to do. A speculator needs somebody else to pay more for it later. And for somebody watching this who owns one home right now, I don't think you need to ask, how do I become a real estate investor? Ask a much smaller, pointed question. What would it take for me to own one investment property? Maybe the answer is not yet. Maybe you need more reserves. Maybe you need to pay down debt. Maybe you need more income. Maybe the numbers in your market simply don't work, and that's okay. But you may be surprised to know the answer is closer than you thought. Maybe it's a duplex. Maybe it's an ADU. Maybe it's buying your next home and keeping the one you already have. Maybe it's a small vacation rental. Maybe it's simply starting to look at real estate differently. Because when we started this episode, I asked you who you picture when you hear the words real estate investor. Maybe you pictured Wall Street, a giant corporation, somebody with hundreds of houses. But the data tells us that isn't the typical investor buying homes in America. More often than most people realize, it's someone considerably closer to home. It's Uncle Earl with the cabin, Aunt May with the Airbnb, the military family renting out the house they left behind, the teacher who inherited her mother's house, your neighbor, your coworker, maybe, eventually, you. That's the next door investor. This has been your mortgage brief for the week. With that, I will leave you with this quote by Van Gogh. Great things are done by a series of small things brought together. For everyone watching, I hope you continue to find opportunities to learn and grow so that you can create better outcomes for yourself and for the people who have trusted you to serve them. My name is Mark, and I am the Gentleman Broker.